For up first, our first speaker today, Adam Taylor, a computational analyst at Lawrence Livermore National Labs, and he will be talking to us about Eucalyptus.
Yes. All right, should I go here?
Yep, you're going to want to be at the microphone.
Gotcha. Hey, everybody. Thanks for coming out today. So this is going to be a talk about this code Eucalyptus, which Luke Peterson wrote, and I'm just here to kind of give a sales pitch about, I guess. But code was designed to analyze uncertainty and push, do uncertainty quantification on fault trees or failure logic trees for complex systems. So we've written a new code called Eucalyptus. The whole idea here is that you can incorporate uncertainty into systems that contain components. Main focus is whether or not certain components exist in the tree. And so, yeah, it's a way you can evaluate the effects of subject matter expert judgment, if you have gaps in knowledge for a system in ways that it might fail. We've written this code, it's deployed, yeah. So the main idea here, the motivating problem is what we call gray box systems. The idea is that you have some knowledge of, what types of components would be, in a system and what its failure logic might look like. But you have uncertain knowledge, right? You have partial, imperfect knowledge. And so if you make various assumptions, subject matter judgments, expertise judgments, you end up with a kind of probability of different responses. And so you want to quantify the benefit of obtaining more knowledge about this system. And so if you have some subcomponents in this gray airplane here, right, and you're not certain if some of these boxes exist, the idea is you can do a Monte Carlo analysis and quantify the value of learning more about the system. So this is sort of the simplest, interesting case you can think of here, where if you have a system with two components and you know that one of them failed, but you're not certain that the second one, you can think of this as a system and a backup system, right? And so if you know that the first system has failed, but you have a 50%, you assess that there's a 50% chance that the backup system even exists, then there's a 50% chance that you have a system failure. So this is just going to introduce the code. So yeah, the code allows for uncertainty and fault tree analysis. You have this input, you basically input a templated fault tree and you assign uncertainty to each component of the tree. And the idea is that you can Monte Carlo discrete realizations of possible trees and do analysis of failure states, propagating the uncertainty in the existence of components. So the input to the system is this kind of tree configuration file where you define the logic of this fault tree and the components, and you assign each component existence probability. And then you can export these into couple of different formats, and you can generate images, PDFs, that kind of thing. You also export into several different reduced order model formats that read in fault trees. Part of the motivation here is to sort of serve as a decoder ring between different codes that use this type of fault tree. And obviously the major feature is that you can quantify the uncertainty of different systems or subsystems existing in the model, and then sample those probabilities. And we have a couple different metrics by which you can assign this. You can just give it a value between 0 and 1, a percentage. There's also these words of estimating the probability you can use. If you say you're almost certain that a component exists, it'll assign this, 63 plus or minus 6% chance. And so you can use these terms and it will automatically sample the probability distributions. So yeah, the idea is that you assume a failure status. You can give Eucalyptus a status vector for different components. And the major feature of the code is that it sort of Monte Carlos this template tree by sampling the probabilities you assign different components. So you get a distribution of possible systems In this simple example, we sampled 50,000 trees, right? And then given this failure state, you can quantify the chance of failure with all of your uncertainty about what actually is in the system built in. And some simple uses, obviously, sensitivity analysis on a gray box system, do scenario modeling if you want to assume different failure states. This can be super useful if you're trying to design something and you want to quantify the effects of putting in, backup systems. It's also if you have to, analyze the failure of somebody else's system and you have imperfect knowledge about that, you can quantify the uncertainty up through your analysis. You also feed this into a ROM if you have some sort of modeling capability. And again, you want to model failure system, scenarios, and you want to sensitivity of a system. Do the same thing, you generate fault trees and then put them into a forward reduced order model. So this is just some simple tests. We put the code through to prove to you that it works as advertised. There is, auto testing is triggered every time there's a code update, and there's all kinds of simple tests for, making sure that the logic is working correctly. These are kind of boring slides, so I'll push through them here. But this is that simple 50% chance of a backup, and you can see that, you run these Monte Carlo analysis, and it converges on the right answer as you sample more and more systems, and correctly solves this problem. One of the major benefits is, you wouldn't need it for the system shown here because it's a relatively simple fault tree. You can kind of eyeball the answers, but if these things become arbitrarily complex and you need to do often, we'll have some examples later where we do millions of fault evaluations. And there's certainly problems where you would want to do billions or tens of billions. And so you can, take advantage of on-node parallelism. Code's written to be parallelized. You see a sort of convergence study here. In optimization, the sweet spot seems to be about 4 cores with a dozen samples. You're trying to get as much bang for your buck as you want out of this thing. So this is a simple, a slightly more complex fault tree. I know this is kind of an eye chart. The details don't really matter here, but it was a system that I had a fault tree that has some interesting features in, and so this image also came out of Eucalyptus, so you can output images for fault trees and help for just visualizing this kind of thing. But I'm going to show 2 kind of modes of using the code. The first one is just that it works as a fault calculator effectively, so you can just put in a deterministic tree and assume different states and just calculate what the probability of failure is. And so I'm calling example 1 here, this deterministic scenario generation. And so in this case, I'm assuming that the fault is static and that all of the components, the leaves in the tree, actually do exist. And so if you have a relatively simple fault tree, you can start to just do an exhaustive kind of combinatorial sweep of states. That gets out of hand pretty quickly, though. There's 52 leaves in this tree. There's 52 different components that exist. If you do the combinatorics here, right, 52 choose K unique ways to fail K components, right? So if you assume there's just one component failure, that's 52 scenarios. You can run them with the fault tree, and that'll tell you which components are singularly vulnerable, the ones that if that component fails, the entire system fails. You got 2 failures, and there's 100 or 1,325. 3, there's about 22,000. But as K becomes larger, this gets out of hand pretty quickly, right? There's something like 15 billion, 10 to the 10 failure scenarios. If you want to fail 10 of the 52 components, there's 10 to the 10 many ways of doing that, right? So for this case, we're just going to look at K equals 1, 2, and 3, and that's what 52 plus 1,300 plus 22,000. So it's like around 23,000 different scenarios, which is you can do on your laptop relatively quickly. And so this is sort of the non-Monte Carlo deterministic approach of just analyzing this fault, which is something that Eucalyptus can do, but it's not really what it's designed for. So in this case, you just evaluate you generate a list of all of those failure states, and you just feed them up this fault tree, right? And so this system is actually pretty vulnerable. Most of the components in the system are singularly vulnerable in this case. So if 48 of the 52 components fail individually, that actually there's a lot of OR logic in the tree, right? So this is not a very robust system actually in this sense. But doing this type of deterministic analysis, you can identify what the vulnerable components are. Then you assume, well, what if there's 48 of the 52 components are singularly vulnerable, which means that there's some more complexity in here. And so you run all the 2-component failures, and you can identify lists of components that if they fail in pairs, and there's 4 of those, and then turns out that each of those 4 pairs of components, if you add all the rest of the components are singularly vulnerable. So there's no failure states that strictly require 3 component failures. But this is the type of thing you can do for one fault tree, right? And if this was more complex, if there was more components and you wanted to, there's maybe more complicated logic, and then you wanted to start doing the uncertainty quantification, you can see how this type of approach would get out of hand pretty quickly. And so the second example I'm going to show you is what this code is actually designed for. It's like, what if you have uncertainty in the trees? If you assign a probability of the existence of each of those 52 components, right? Then you can sample those probabilities and develop a whole ensemble of different trees that either have or don't have certain components in the model. And so we're going to just assume some baseline. And this is when we move into a kind of more Monte Carlo situation where you can't exhaustively calculate all the failure probabilities for each of those trees. You generate 1,000 trees. This grows, the calculations grow exponentially. So move into a Monte Carlo framework. In this case, we're just going to assume, there's 1,000. We're going to sample 1,000 different fault trees, and then out of each of those, we're going to do 1,000 samples each of 1 or 2 component failures. This is kind of, given that we already did the deterministic analysis on the template, there's not too much interesting happening after 2 component failures because you kind of know that the system has failed. So that ends up being totally, for each, you evaluate failure probability based on baseline knowledge first. So what you do here, let me just kind of talk through the algorithm, is that it's going to, for each of the 52 components, it's going to, first of all, assume they all exist, and then run these 1,000 samples of failures up the tree. And then it's going to, one by one, assume you have perfect knowledge of each component, and then do the 1,000 tree samples based on each 52. And so this way you get to quantify sort of the value of learning whether or not each component individually exists. And so you propagate, the way we like to describe it is you're quantifying the value of specific bits of further knowledge of the system. So Eucalyptus spits out these nice graphs. It does this analysis one by one, assuming one random failure, going through that process, and then assuming 2. And so what you see here kind of closely echoes, again, because this tree wasn't super complex, the variance off of the deterministic cases we just calculated is pretty small. But you see that, given the baseline assumptions of the probability of existence of each component, you have for one failure, you have about an 86% chance of the system failing. And then if you learn that all the components do exist, that goes up a little bit. Notice that some of these, the variance off of the mean either go up or down, depending on if you gain more knowledge, which is a little non-intuitive if you think about it. But it basically, the way to think about this is that you're learning, if you learn that something exists, your probability of the system failure can go up or down if you're learning more about a redundancy in the system, or if it's another failure mode. And so learning more doesn't necessarily mean that your system becomes more or less vulnerable. You just have more perfect knowledge about the system itself. Yeah, and that's pretty much the end here. We've been updating the code. We have Imen Gormiri in the audience here today. She's been running this project and doing a lot of quality of life updates and making the code more usable and friendly. There's more outputs. It's easier to get at the data that it generates, so you can send it off to different workflows. Obviously, we're fixing bugs, and we're testing on larger, more representative real-world problems. We are working on kind of optimizing the performance for larger trees. Again, you can imagine systems that are arbitrarily complex, and so the code calculates everything as advertised, but It's not necessarily optimized for large data sets yet, so we're working on that. Yeah, this is the summary slide. I'm not going to read it to you because I just told you everything. Are there any questions for me?
How do we get access to this?
I like that question. Email Amen and she will give you access. That's the kind of question I like.
So in your using parallel processing on your 4 cores, when you're like moderate size, like how long would that take to run?
It depends. So when you're in Monte Carlo mode and you don't know the answer to the problem, you don't really know how many samples you need for convergence. So it's kind of hard to say in general.
That's also what I was getting
Right,
was how many replications needed to get rid of your uncertainty in
you kind of want, if there's a system that you really needed to know the answer to, you would have to do a convergence study like anything else. But it is these, all of the data I did here for whatever this ended up being, so I think something like, I think it was 30 million or 104 million fault evaluations total for this simple example.
Mm-hmm.
I did that on my laptop in 10 minutes. So you really have to get big before you even probably went to an HPC.
Yeah.
But it's available, it's the whole, if you're imagining ensembles of systems that are arbitrarily complex and you're doing billions and billions of evaluations on each of them, that would probably take a long time on your laptop and you would take advantage of your HPC if you had one. And so, but as far as scaling to larger and larger problem, we haven't really done all of that analysis yet. I would encourage you to use the code and let me know how it scales for your problem.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Cool. Anybody else? Okay, thank you very much.